My name is Rocky Monroe, and today I'll be presenting the timeline of railways in Britain. My project will mainly be outlined by me covering 4 different main eras of British railway history. Each individual cluster of slides will contain a rough breakdown of the timeline and general historical events that happened during these individual periods of railway history for you to generally understand a very rough and somewhat odd outline of the timeline of railways in Britain. It is not going to be a very deep and in-depth coverage of railway history, but it is the best way to introduce people into the general timeline of railways of Britain. The first era of time that we'll be covering is the pre-grouping era, which ran from 1804 to 1923. This includes the birth of steam in general, and that is what I will open us up with. Now, the birth of steam came in the form of a small industrial locomotive built for an ironworks in Penydarren of South Wales, known simply as the Penydarren locomotive. It was built by engineer Robert Trevithick, and it was a very experimental early locomotive. It was the first one to be, in fact, so of course it was not particularly good. It ran on the 21st of February 1804. It had a 2-mile-per-hour top speed with an 11-coach rake of coal, and it only made about 3/4 of the maiden journey that it was meant to make before breaking down and just sort of accentuating how it may not have been the best prototype engine to ever exist. Despite the engine's rather lackluster performance and general operation, this locomotive started the general craze of steam locomotives in history, and through a couple decades and multiple reworks of how steam locomotives ran, you had yourself railway mania and the birth of modern steam traction. The growth of railways in the aftermath of the birth of steam became rapid. Many different companies became existent and grew to massive sizes. Many more got created, and they grew all across Britain's borders and became these complicated aspects of people's lives. They became much bigger locomotives, became more complicated, and the general way that railways operated was much more complicated than a simple little industrial locomotive running from one end of the line to the other. And it was mainly because of this complication that it blossomed into this new age of industrialization that formed how Britain ran itself in its home border. This amount of growth in industrialization came with a large amount of companies making their own engines and running their own railways, which included such companies as the London and North Western Railway, the Highland Railway, the Furness Railway, the London, Brighton and South Coast Railway, the Hull, Barnsley and West Riding Junction Railway and Dock Company. I'm not going to say every single last company that existed during the early 1900s because well over 120 railways existed in total within the borders of Britain, and that number is not entirely exact, so there was probably even more. Despite this major amount of growth and industrialization, a certain historical event known as World War I threw a wrench in the gears of how these engines and companies were operating. See, during World War I, the wartime necessities that were needed during the time were undertaken by 2 boards formed during the time, known as the Railway Executive Committee and the ROD, also known as the Railway Operations Division. They helped control wartime operations during the time, and while they were very effective, it also accentuated a lot of the weaknesses of the companies that existed before it. They were clunky, they didn't run as efficiently, and because many of them were competing against each other, it didn't make as efficient of a country in general. It was a bit clunky, overdone, and not as efficient. So in the aftermath of World War I, in this new era coming out of the conflict, a Grouping Act of 1923 ended up causing a major ultimatum to the companies. The 120 railways were reformed into big constituent companies of only 4, which opens us up to our next era, known as the Grouping Era, or the Big Four, which ran from 1923 to 1948. The Big Four era gets its name from the Big Four companies that existed during the time: the London and North Eastern Railway, the London, Midland and Scottish Railway, the Great Western Railway, and the Southern Railway. Now, the map on the right is not an accurate map to the era, it comes from a later era, but it gives a good idea of the size and the scope of these individual companies that existed within it. The LNER would have been made up of the Eastern region, the Northeastern region, and one half of the Scottish region. The London Midland region and the other half of the Scottish region would have made up the LMS, the Western region would have made up the Great Western, and the Southern region would have made up the Southern region. Now, The first of the big four, the LNER, has some very distinct characteristics that really set it apart from the rest, and all of the big four really do have very prominent characteristics that set them apart. The LNER's big characteristic was their big engine policy and their their claim to fortune when it came down to the popularity of many of their locomotives. On the right, you see an A3 class passenger locomotive, and on the right, you see an A4 class Pacific passenger locomotive. The CME of the company, Sir Herbert Nigel Gresley, the man standing next to the engine with his name, was well known for making these large, very popular, and very gorgeous looking passenger locomotives that very easily enthralled the populace and the passengers of the company. It quickly became probably one of the most popular companies in the entire region, and it quickly gained its fame mainly because of these popular locomotives, the express passenger services, and the fact that many of their locomotives have broke several world records and still claim these records to this day. One of the A4 locomotives, the engine off to the left, not specifically, but the type of locomotive, one by the name of Mallard, still holds to this day the world speed record for steam engines at 126 miles per hour. Despite all this fame and fortune, the company really didn't have a lot of fortune. It was the least profitable of all the companies, mainly due to the amount of debt that it incurred from the different companies that it gathered up during the 1923 grouping. The next locomotive company in the group is the LMS, and it is the biggest out of all of them. Despite this rather large size and interesting setup of companies that it had to absorb, it was very dysfunctional when it first formed. The different companies that it absorbed, despite being very interesting and having a lot of things going for them, fought a lot, and so it made a very dysfunctional company in the early days. It did not get easier as time went on, and it was only fixed and sort of radicalized when a CME by the name of Sir William Stanier stepped in and designed a number of great exceptional locomotives that really brought people under the identity of what the LMS was. Off to the right, you see a Stanier Black 5, one of the most popular locomotives and a big symbol of what the LMS was. And off to the left, you see a streamlined original condition Coronation class Pacific locomotive, at the time being the most powerful steam locomotive of all in Britain and being a great contender against the LNER's Pacific passenger locomotives. The next company out of the roster is the Great Western Railway, and it was a bit of an oddball due to the fact that it was not actually formed during the 1923 grouping. You see, the Great Western existed during the previous generation, during the previous era, and due to the fact of its popularity at the time, it just sort of absorbed the rest of the companies that existed around it and became one of the big four, unlike the rest of the companies where they just popped out of existence from the grouping. Despite this, the Great Western Railway had a very strong identity. It had a very prominent look to it, known as Swindon Heritage, where it had a lot of standardized parts and a very specific look to a lot of its locomotives. Even though many of them had vastly different designs between different needs, they all looked like Great Western locomotives, and this created a very strong company identity, and it eventually ended up being well known for its tourist attractions and its ability of cheap fare and allow for you to visit the beautiful sights of Britain. On my right, you see a 1400 class tank engine, well known for the branch line works and commuter trains. And on my left, you see a King's class locomotive, the top premier passenger locomotive of the Great Western. The final company of the four was the Southern Railway, or the SR, and it was known for being sort of an oddball. It was the smallest of the railways, but it also earned the most money, mainly because of its location, which also affected how the steam locomotives were designed. Because of its location, it made most of its profit off of passenger service, unlike the rest of the Big Four, which made it mostly off of freight services. Mainly because of its location, meaning that it ran from large crowded docks that brought in a lot of people from all over the world into the big crowded cities of Britain and different areas. Because of this, the locomotives were not as up to date or as fancy, but still as effective and were a bit lighter because of the gloating gauges of the areas. On the left, you see the Lord Nelson class, which is a very good idea of the sort of locomotive designed for the SR. And they didn't build a lot of new locomotives over the course of its lifetime up until World War II, when a new CME was brought into the company by the name of Robert Bullied, who built unusual and odd and not entirely prototypical locomotives that were still well beloved and fit the nature of the SR, such as the locomotive on the right, the Battle of Britain class locomotives, which were very odd and didn't fit the standards of the day, but were very popular. As I said, World War II had a very big effect on the Big Four in the fact that it really disrupted their ability to work. You see, the REC was formed again from World War I, and this time helped work during the Blitz and the general chaos that was Britain during World War II. The Big Four were run pretty ragged during World War II. Their locomotives were pushed to the absolute end of their working lives. In many cases, some locomotives being pulled right out of being withdrawn back into service just to serve for another couple of years, just to be withered right down to the bone. Maintenance was very strict and limited, and in general, it was very harsh on the different rolling stock of the company. By the end of 1948, all the different companies were bankrupt. They were worn out and they were desperately in need of change, either a return to how things had been before the war, or something new on the horizon. And of course, the British government decided to create something new with the Transport Act of 1947, creating the Government Constituent Company of British Railways, which nationalized the entirety of Britain's rails and opened us up into our next era, the nationalization era, which ran from 1947 to 1968. Now, era underneath the British railways during nationalization was a mixed bag. You see, the British government had very strict wants and needs by the railways and locomotives, and so it had a lot of very strict ways of running it purely by profit and by wanting it to be as efficient as possible. The locomotives did not get an ease up in conditions. While it was no longer wartime conditions, it was still exceedingly strict. A lot of older locomotives were withdrawn rather quickly once the company was formed, and regions were split up into strict dividends and areas, as I showed on the map previously, to make sure that they were as operable as possible. Engines were shuffled around to try and see if they could work in different areas to hopefully improve operations, but it was realized quickly that a lot of these locomotives that they inherited from the Big Four were simply not as compatible in other areas they hadn't been designed for. And so rising demand for tighter timetables and general demands of the new era led to something known as the BR standards. They were the last line of steam engine design for any British railway company in the entire country, and were known as one of the last eras of modern steam traction. There was a large amount of standard parts when they came with them, and they were meant to be as compatible as possible with different areas of Britain so that hopefully, they could be as effective as possible and money could be easily gained from their running. They had a rough life service of about 30-year shelf life, and despite this, in the following year, the 1955 modernization plan quickly put them aside. The 1955 modernization plan basically meant that all steam traction in all of Britain would be withdrawn by the decade and replaced with modern diesel locomotives. The standards, despite many of them only being 4 to 5 years of age at this point, were put into the same category as engines they had got that were much, much older and expected to be withdrawn within the decade. This was also compounded by the report of the Beeching Cuts, also known as the Beeching Acts, which basically outlined the closure of many small branch lines that existed off the main lines of Britain, basically further speeding up the demise of steam locomotives in the country of Britain. The last steam run special allowed on British railways before the entirety of steam locomotives were banned on the entirety of British network was the 15 Guinea Special held on August the 11th, 1968. There was 3 locomotives that helped pull this special excursion: 2 Black 5s, number 45110 and 44871, and a Britannia Standard class by number 70013, Oliver Cromwell. This was the last major steam locomotive passenger pulled by them, and the next day, all steam locomotives on the entirety of British networks was banned. This was the closing of an era, the coming of the end of steam, yet it was also the opening of a new era, our last era in our line, the Preservation Era, which ran from 1968 to the modern era. The Preservation Era is mainly marked by the creation of heritage railways and the National Collection. The National Collection is a government-run agency that collects and keeps a rather large museum of pieces of old railway traction and history that keeps them alive and fresh for the world to see. Heritage railways are more accurate where live steam engines run on their own branch lines and areas, and one of the first major heritage railways was the Bluebell Railway with their number 55 steam locomotive tank engine down in the bottom left corner, Stepney. One of the major big turning points in the preservation movement in the growing years was actually the first new build steam locomotive number 60163 Tornado, the locomotive up in the top right. It was completed in 2003, and it was the first steam locomotive built in Britain since the 50s, and that was a rather big part of preservation, as beforehand most of it was just preserving older locomotives and keeping them in good shape. But the existence of tornado, which was the resurrection of a otherwise extinct class of steam locomotives, brought to the idea that you could not only try to keep history alive, but also reinvigorate it and bring new engines into existence for the sake of preservation. And combine that with the growing boom of the National Railway Museum, which keeps locomotives in preserved museum pieces in various states of running or preserved static display, means that preservation is not going away anytime soon. The preserved engines all across Britain, whether they be static displays or running steam locomotives that have varying certifications on both mainline and branch line runnings, accentuates that Britain's heritage continues to live on. I'm by no means a obsessor who thinks that every aspect of Britain's history is some glamorous thing to look at, but when it comes down to the railroading history of Britain, it is one of those things you can't help but marvel at, even if you don't find it the most interesting of all. The simple history of all these large metal machines affecting and growing to such massive size and having such a big effect on Britain's culture is simply fascinating. This is the end of my project, and I hope that it was enjoyable.